So we are going to be joined by two additional panelists to help us with our conversation. Sitting next to me is Sheila Coclasure, who is the Senior Vice President of Global Digital Responsibility and Public Policy at the Interpublic Group. And next to her, on her left, is Jeanette Hofmann, who is Professor of Internet Politics at the Free University of Berlin. And then Josh Chen and Andreas. And we're live. So this is great, actually. Let's start here. I'm a big user of Otter too. And what's striking about Otter, and there are about, actually, I counted 13 of these automated speech transcription services that have emerged just in the last year. And what's striking, I've covered Silicon Valley for a long time, and what's striking is when you have order of magnitude changes, in this case in price. I'm working on a book, and I began at the end of 2017, and I've done a lot of interviews. I used a previous crowdsourced service to do those interviews, rev.com. I spent more than $15,000 on my interviews. If I was using Otter, which is automated and not using crowdsourced humans, but it's about as accurate, I would spend about $100 a year. That is a striking order of magnitude change. So what I want to ask the panel first, what are the unintended consequences of having a facility like Otter? What's going to happen that we don't expect?
I've realized how bad my memory is. So I sometimes look at transcripts in the past and said, what? I never said that. And then in Otter, you can click on the word, and it says in my voice. So maybe they have just some really good deep fakes.
Well, there's the deep fake question. Right. Josh?
I guess everyone probably can guess what I'm going to say. But you mentioned that there are a lot of automated transcription services. China is actually one of the leading countries for natural language processing. Baidu and a bunch of other companies have been doing this for a long time. And there are several really, really good for Chinese language, for Mandarin programs out there. And I don't use them for any interviews that could possibly be sensitive. Because all of that data, at least in China, and probably, I'm curious, probably to a certain degree in the US, is ultimately available to the government, right? So as a journalist, anyway, if I'm conducting interviews and I want to transcribe those interviews, if they're sensitive and I'm worried about the government getting that data, then I will not use those services. Yeah.
Jeanette, do you have any
I had
thoughts?
some time to think about it. I was just reminded of this practice of surveying, using cameras to video, say, policemen who get violent or something. So perhaps we start using that software to transcript what other people are saying.
Yeah.
Like surveillance, Unterwachung.
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Glad to be here. Thank you for having me. I think there are really two sides to this coin. I think on one hand, it goes to accountability, right? When you have a capture mechanism like this that captures everything, the history is scribed down and it becomes rather immutable, maybe fakeable, but immutable. The other side of the coin, I think, goes to this whole notion of surveillance. And what I think we all know to be true is observation changes behavior. And I think that this level of observation, added to all the other types of surveillance that are coming online very, very quickly, has a dramatic likelihood of changing the trajectory of how we behave as humans. I worry that we are going to get to a place where there is no place where we can be free, unobserved, and natural humans.
Well, to your point, one of the things that Otter wants to do with this technology is that, here's a question. Do you own your speech when you're at work? Because Otter wants to use this ubiquitously inside corporations to capture all of that water cooler conversation. Now, the argument is that will make these companies who use this technology more efficient because you'll be able to extract stuff about corporate behavior.
Do you not think that's going to impede some of the creative free flow of dialogue where you're being observed and recorded and there's going to be some use of that later? So instead of just letting it flow, you're going to have to be very measured and think about what you say as you have your water cooler conversation. How many of us have done exactly that, said something or said something and it was recorded and misremembered. Oh, I didn't say that. And then you go back and in fact, it's not what you meant, but it's actually what came out of your mouth at that time. So I think it's a very interesting future that we're accelerating into.
Yeah. Go ahead, Andreas.
Yeah. So I would like to take the opposite position in saying, when I'm being recorded, then I actually speak much more clearly than if I just think I'm talking to Josh after a third beer in Beijing.
That is true.
What's the alternative is always the question. And I think the alternative is to rely on our memories. And there, I rather rely on technology, particularly if the access is not asymmetrical. So, example, Bridgewater. Ray Dalio, Bridgewater is user corporate of order, where everything is recorded. The question is, who gets access to the recordings? Is it only the managers, only selectively? And as we learned from Siggy, that is a hard part if you never know what's being recorded and who has access to it. Or do we just put it up internally at the company? Yeah. I have one more example, if I may. A friend of mine at Deutsche Bank, the chief innovation officer, opened up all the email he got and all the email he sent to anybody who was working at Deutsche Bank. He, of course, was monitoring what people were looking at. And
without telling them.
What's that?
Without telling them that he was monitoring them.
Without telling them. I mean, but I mean, I would assume that people know that there are logs of what they do at the workplace. So probably somewhere it's said in the contract that everything you do, everything you ever possibly think about, we own and will record. Long story short, he said, J.D. Ramazami said, nobody cared for his inbox. People only cared for his outbox. And number two is those people whose main job was to bicker why they can't get stuff done because somebody else wasn't sending them what they needed. They all quit.
So I remember, Christoph, we have an opportunity to sort of bring the audience in early. Is it possible to switch to the screen that will allow you to sort of, is it possible to bring up the poll that we wanted to have? You all have an application called, is it called Attendify?
Attendify, it's not on the screen, it's on the app.
Ah, okay.
See, like, the poll coming up in activities.
Okay, so I invite you to go to your app, and there's a poll there, which is 3 questions. And you can participate at your leisure, and Christoph will, at the end, give us the results if there are any, if everybody's not just looking at the outbox.
Can you project? I don't know what the questions are. Can you project them?
We can also not project them right now, but I give you my cell phone and you can read them.
Oh, yeah, okay, that's good. I'll read them out. Okay. So people are already participating. Okay, the first is a very broad question. Will democracy survive the internet? Yes or no? Second one is, should Facebook and Google be broken up? Yes or no? And the third one is, will China achieve its goal of world leadership in AI by 2030? Yes or no? So any thoughts that you have, we'll give the results of the poll at the end. And let me start our panel with that first large question. Will democracy survive the internet? We had 2 fairly dark talks and 1 slightly optimistic talk. Where is the panel in terms of your sort of general sense of the impact of the internet on modern democracies?
I'll just jump in and say, I think Andreas hit on something that is central to this whole discussion, and that is data is inevitable. We all walk around with at least 1, if not 2, 3, 4 smart devices. So each one of us and eventually every human on the planet is going to be creating these clouds of data just by living every second of every day. So data is inevitable and the pace of technology is accelerating. So technology is becoming rather inevitable. So here's what it comes down to. It comes down to our fundamental human values and our intentionality. We have to have motive, then we have to set up guidelines for how we will use the data. This is the example. It can be used for things that harm us, or it can be used to create benefits. And so I think we're at an inflection point in human history where we have to be very intentional. Just came from Albania last week, where the International Commission of Data Protection and Privacy commissioners around the world gather for once a year to talk about these issues that are looming before mankind. And the theme of the conference this year was accountability and data ethics. And how do we do that in a corporate setting was the focus of it. Yeah. So democracy will survive, but only if we're very intentional and we design governance around the use of data and the use of algorithms that protect our human values.
So I would say that I've been listening to this whole discussion this morning, and what I noticed also already yesterday at the workshops is that many people seem to think that there is nearly an autonomous way for technology to drive forward. And I think that is a mistake. It's completely open, particularly digital technology is open to sort of develop and evolve in many different ways. But for us to see that and to make use of that flexibility of technology, we need much more diversity. And diversity, I would say, one principle that supports diversity is human rights. We need to protect human rights, particularly vis-a-vis technologies. We've talked about privacy a lot this morning, data protection, and I think that is a basic principles for people to have the freedom to innovate in many more ways than just follow their boss. So what we need to do is to strengthen human rights in times when we automate more and more decisions formerly done by human beings. We need to make sure that society is strong enough for self-determination, also with regard to technologies. That's why we developed this initiative in Europe to think about a Charter for Digital Human Rights to actually make human rights stronger. And I would say that technology development would ultimately benefit if we sort of strengthen human rights in times when it seems to be threatened by many technical developments. So of course democracy will survive, but we want to not diminish it compared to the past.
Josh, you live and work in a non-democratic environment. I was there in 2017, and I was struck in being in the third ring in Beijing at how completely the Chinese had embraced Silicon Valley's norms, our values, with the exception of they didn't worry about that democracy thing.
Right.
That was, so
right.
What does it look from inside?
I think it's interesting, right? I think if you talk about, the assumption used to be, obviously everyone here knows that the internet in particular, but technology in general, was a democratizing force, right? And famously with China, Bill Clinton said that trying to control the internet was like nailing Jell-O to the wall. You just couldn't do it, right? And so that's why we should open up to China, because they'll get the internet and then they'll become free. And that obviously didn't happen. In fact, the exact opposite has happened. And I think there are people now who've flipped completely on the other side, who think that actually, in some ways, the technologies that are really developing now are actually the logic of those technologies, optimization-based technologies actually sort of graph pretty nicely onto authoritarian governments, right? The sort of top-down, efficiency, productivity-driven processes, right? And the Communist Party sees it that way. They see, they believe that the big data and AI are going to give them the tools to be responsive in ways that democratic governments aren't, yeah. Right? And that they can maybe even produce an alternative to democracy that is more attractive, and that kind of goes all the way through. And they're harnessing. They've got big, powerful companies that are sort of on board with that as well.
Jeanette, do you want to answer?
My feeling is that we always emphasize the differences between China and the West, and I'm often not sure whether that really makes sense. Often we see a rather gradual difference when it comes to social scoring, for example. Social scoring happens in the West as well.
Sure. Yeah.
Of course, it's not within a totalitarian system, but still we use the same technologies, and we seem to develop in a similar direction. So that's why I emphasize this this thing with digital rights. I was just reading this morning an article in the New York Times about workforce within Google, within Facebook, and other companies protesting against the decisions of their management. Don't we need to sort of strengthen their rights, that they can sort of get their voice in company decisions towards a more human-centered technology development?
Are there models for having worker voice in the corporate? I mean, is it different in Europe?
In Europe, they have. In Europe, they definitely have. They have more rights. They are unionized. The IT sector is a bit special in this respect because there's much less unionization than in other industries. But of course, they used to voice a lot of protest.
Yeah. So to your point about sort of directing the flow of technologies as opposed to saying technology is just on its own, what has been the consequence of the GDPR, which was an effort to do that? Can the panel members talk to the impact of GDPR?
I'll jump in. At the time, I was Global Chief Data Ethics Officer of a large data processing enterprise, and I had to take our enterprise through GDPR readiness. Now, the good news for us is it was a housekeeping exercise because we'd been on the data governance path for many years. But the reality is, and the result is 63%, I think is the number I've heard, of European companies were not compliant with the European data protection framework. So contrary to regulatory assumption that GDPR would be an update, it was a complete overhaul. Now, GDPR is great, actually. It is an accountability law. It is a housekeeping. It forces companies to get control of their data, where it came from, how it travels, how it's processed, and where it's going for what purpose. And it's a forcing mechanism for a very good cause, very good, valid reasons, and we all like it. Now, was it perfect? Is it future prepared? No. Have companies struggled? Companies have struggled mightily. Did it create some market contraction? Yes, it did. A lot of small companies left the market, and a lot of other medium companies contracted because the costs of compliance were so incredible, and in certain instances, their business models, they simply could not get in compliance with the technical letter of the law.
Are you suggesting a concentration of control that worked to the advantage of large companies?
I am suggesting that the GDPR had the effect. As a part of the market contracted, another part of the market, American big tech, picked up that market share.
Yeah. Andreas, do you have thoughts?
So when I meet with some startups here, the question always is, if everything goes perfectly, where will we be? And then I take a plane for 12 hours or whatever it is to Germany. And the other question is, if everything goes wrong, where will we be? So I think it's all like a bell curve. It's a distribution as part of sort of data literacy to know that things are not black and white, as one of you said. Do you focus on the right tail of the distribution, the positive stuff? That's what Silicon Valley is about. Or do you focus on the left tail of the distribution, on the things that can go wrong? Or do you focus on the center of the distribution, as I would say China does, of moving the mean a little bit to the left? So saying in a different word, I think it's about economics. When I got here in '86, my PhD advisor gave me a modem and a terminal and said, Andreas, you log in the morning and you log on off night. And I said, wow, that is amazing. My dad, who was a high school teacher, his salary wouldn't have sufficed in Germany to pay for the connection time of 10 hours a day. So what we have here, in some way, is the right to be connected. What Germans seem to have is the right to be disconnected. You know, some major companies turn the emails off on the weekend because poor employees should not have the temptation to check the emails. So I think that, for me, is a transatlantic gap which we have. When we talk about rights, so let's talk about those. Is it a right to be connected, which I embrace, or do you think we should have a right to be disconnected?
That's a tough one.
I think the freedom would be to determine for yourself, but your company should not expect you to be connected over the weekend. And you should not be at a disadvantage if you disconnect over the weekend.
But you are. The world moves on. So, I mean, if you don't have a startup and you say, oh, I'm taking my weekend off, you are disadvantaged. Would I, as a VC or as an investor, rather give the money to somebody who exercises his or her right to be disconnected, or somebody who says, I'll do whatever needs to be done to make my startup successful?
Then you better don't do business in Europe.
So I want to ask about technology and national boundaries. You kind of talked about how the Clintonian promise of the internet really hadn't played out very well in China. John Gilmore, who was an internet pioneer, famously said at the dawn of the net, his quote was, "The net views censorship as damage and rounds around it accordingly." It hasn't really played out that way, has it? And yet, it's weird because clearly the internet has erased national boundaries in many ways. I mean, look at Brexit and the last election in the United States. Clearly, those boundaries have gotten very mushy. So what's going on? And should we have national boundaries with respect to nets?
Well, I'll just jump in and say, for a data company that processes data for very large multinationals all over the world, data flow is global, and digital is very hard to regulate geographic boundaries. And when we were doing the GDPR readiness, we do a lot of processing that we did at the time, that company. We did a lot of processing of our European clients' data in the US. And a lot of it, digital, real time, sub-second, zero latency kind of stuff. And we had to, and this was a very foreign concept to all of the American companies that were processing European citizen data, we had to pretty insistently help them implement a series of sniffers so they could sniff IPs and treat the European traffic differently. And it's just a cost and it's a burden. So the question is, still today, you have to do things geographically because of the legal constructs. And I always say this, the law is just the starting point of what we should and shouldn't do, right? Law is things we've already decided is right or wrong. It's a cultural norm we've codified, right? And that's where you start. And then you've got to go that next level and you've got to do a harms test. Is there bias? Is there discrimination? And then there's this thing, and this is a very popular resonant term everywhere in the world where we're talking about data, data use, data literacy, data legitimacy, digital responsibility, and algorithmic responsibility, and this notion of fairness, which is highly contextualized. Right. I say all that to bring us back to another geographic quandary or dilemma, as Andreas said earlier, a dilemma. Is we have one here in the United States with the new California law. And we have to decide, are we going to sniff all the data flow and the data processing and treat California citizen data differently than the rest of the US? So
will you? Have you decided?
It becomes an economic issue.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you have a data processing system that supports your entire US business, are you going to carve out a section and do all the cost economic infrastructure kind of stuff to support that when it may not be deemed fair? So, it's...
Right.
Or you can just go one step further and just do the Facebook thing, which says, we do whatever we want to, and then we have to pay $2 a user. How big a fine is that? $2 a user. That's the economics. Ignore it.
I would say, in terms of national borders, that there are actually many different contradictory systems at work at the moment. When you think, for example, of copyright protection, it's still a very national regime. With Netflix, you get to see something completely different in the US than in Germany again than in the UK. So it depends a bit on the market, but also it depends very much on citizens' sort of habits and interests, to what degree we see a transnational integration or not. But copyright definitely sticks to its national business model.
Yeah, but data is going to be the underpinning of all economies very, very soon, if not already. GDPR in particular is the global standard and will be for the next 10 years, most certainly. because they intend it to be, and because they are binding GDPR in their trade deals. Look at Japan; it was the first.
Yeah, but
right. So this is a specific intentionality. The Europeans feel like they've got it right.
Yeah.
They've got the balance right, and they are going to put pressure on all the other countries they trade with. If you want to trade with Europe, you're going to have to become adequate with GDPR.
Yeah, that's true, but the implementation differs significantly between continents and also within Europe and outside of Europe.
Yes, it does right now, and I know even inside of Europe, the 28 EEA countries, or whatever the number is right now, they have they have derogations, right? How many ever derogations? I think the number's like 123, 130 derogations in GDPR that each of the member countries are implementing according to their cultural norms. We also have, with the EDPB, the European Data Protection Board, that is the collection of each of the member countries' data protection official coming together to interpret and decide how to apply GDPR. And remember, we are just at the beginning of GDPR. It really hasn't even happened yet. It is getting ready to happen. The UK ICO just added 300 people, right? Ireland's going back for another round, and they're like the second largest now. Everybody is staffing and gearing up, and it's all about to happen. It hadn't even hit yet, but the point is there is a lot of variation, and it becomes an economic issue how you're going to handle your data.
I wanted to go back to Sigbert's story. In Josh's reporting, and there's been reporting in The Intercept and the New York Times, it's been 6 years since Edward Snowden revealed the NSA's operation. And in this reporting that I've been seeing recently, it looks like China has become the exporter of that technology of record. I mean, is that what's going on? I mean, and looking at perhaps the Intercept was the clearest example of this. It looks like they're exporting pretty much the system that Snowden revealed, and arbitrary countries can buy this and deploy it. Is that where we are?
Well, I mean, it's not just China. I mean, it's interesting that you bring up Snowden, because actually the Snowden revelations were the, China might have gone the direction it's going already anyway, but Snowden really set them on this path. It really freaked China out how much the US knew about what was happening in China, and that's sort of China's entire move down to sort of, you talk about tech decoupling, right, and like building its own internet and its own systems and its own companies and doing its own surveillance. A lot of that was because of Snowden. China is probably the biggest exporter, but Israel is a huge exporter as well, and the US. Yeah. And we also know that, there's Australian companies, there's Canadian companies. Everyone is in this. This is a huge market. Yeah. But China is the one that is probably doing the biggest job in terms of exporting them as like a sort of a plug-and-play surveillance system.
But that all falls within the framework of what's called lawful intercept. Is that right? Is that the market that they're selling into? It's just that lawful intercept means something very different than it once did a half a decade.
Yeah, the arguments, if you talk to like a company like Huawei, so we did a story about Huawei in Uganda, right, where they had basically been brought in by Museveni, the leader in Uganda, to install a police surveillance system, and they basically ended up hacking. One of Huawei's employees ended up helping the police there hack into the WhatsApp communications of a opposition politician. But their argument was that this is all legal under Ugandan law. Everything that's happening, the police are allowed to do all of this, and so they don't see any problem with it. And that this notion of, which actually kind of traces a little bit back to 9/11, right, the U.S. policy, that threats to national security can be used to justify all sorts of invasions of privacy, and that's sort of what's happening around the globe right now. So.
And a lot of it is based on the distinction between citizens and non-citizens. It seems from a national point of view always okay, meaning legitimate to spy on non-citizens. And that, I think, is one of the things we really need to think about in terms of human rights. Does it really make sense to distinguish between citizens and non-citizens in a world that is integrated to such a great degree? Shouldn't we expand our understanding of human rights also to non-citizens? That would also sort of put more restraint on that kind of espionage.
I think, we can talk about human rights all day long. Look at Hong Kong. How brilliant the execution of the People's Republic of China is when it comes to Hong Kong. For decades, they've geared up to the situation. They built the Great Firewall, part of the reason why I left, because I couldn't get stuff done anymore. And, there are human rights, I think, clearly violated, at least what I read in the Wall Street Journal. I've been there, but that doesn't help us. The question is, what do we do? And it's frustrating for us believing in democracy that what can we do about Hong Kong? Military action? No, not an option. We wouldn't know what to do. Is it economic? Let's go to our companies, which we know, and try them to boycott it. But that would hit the people, the citizens in Hong Kong. So it's actually very difficult. The rights are good and easy to agree on, as is the UN 49, I think. But what are the actions? What's the economics of the actions?
So I might actually take exception with your point there, Andreas. So I don't think, I think there are plenty of people who feel like Hong Kong is an example of how this authoritarianism, digital authoritarianism hasn't worked, right? Because has not worked, right? Because the Communist Party certainly did not have in mind regular protests of 1 million people, 2 million people going through the streets of Hong Kong, stopping traffic, getting international headlines. I mean, that is not what the party envisioned for Hong Kong. They wanted Hong Kong to be cheering in the streets when it finally got handed over to China 100%, right? So I think that, they've been making efforts, digitally. I mean, in some ways similar to Russia and the US, they dominate media in Hong Kong. They try to manipulate public opinion on the internet in Hong Kong, and that has all actually failed them in a certain really important way. Some people would argue, and you also, interestingly, you have protests in Hong Kong where they are even though there isn't actually a lot of facial recognition technology in Hong Kong yet, the protesters there are extremely aware of all of this. So they go out wearing masks. They don't use. They've all put aside they're called octopus cards in Hong Kong. It's a card that you use for everything: the subway, buses, 7-Eleven. They don't use those because they can be tracked to your identity. So now they're using paper subway tickets. And people who support the students are buying stacks of paper subway tickets and just leaving them in the subway stations for protesters to use, so their location can't be tracked. So I think you actually have. I mean, Hong Kong is a really interesting picture of what democratic resistance is going to look like in the digital age, I think.
But if they did away with all of the manual, paper-based kind of systems, then it was fully digitized. I think they could control the propaganda and the people a little bit better.
Another argument for diversity.
Perhaps audit trails. So let me take this opportunity to ask the panel about your sense of whether there's a consensus about the impact or the effectiveness of Cambridge Analytica, both in Brexit and in the US election. There's been a big debate. There's sort of a couple of questions. There's Cambridge Analytica's assertions about the power of micro-targeting. Is it possible to suppress a vote in a significant way? Did that happen? And then there's also the question of, did it get to the Internet Research Association? Was it Internet Research? Yeah, in Moscow, and did that have an effect? Do you know, what do you feel, and do you think there's a consensus at this point?
I love that question. First of all, I think there's consensus about the fact that Cambridge Analytica did this also for marketing purposes, to imply how effective and manipulative their systems are. But then when you look at the empirical evidence, it's very unclear to what extent you can actually manipulate individual users, also particularly over time. You don't know if you sort of manage to convince someone once, whether that would work again next time at the next election. But what I've seen in the academic literature is that if there was an impact, then it's more likely to happen in systems with a majority electoral system than in proportional representative systems where you have many parties. So Brexit is a case in point because the result was so very narrow. So if they managed to convince 2% of the people, that would have had an impact.
Yeah. Any other thoughts about Cambridge Analytica? Andreas, this is your world.
So I think the key question is, what are our fears? And my fear, my data fear, is really the fear of being manipulated without knowing it. And that one, having worked at Amazon, having built those manipulation machines called recommendation systems, knowing how well they work, I am absolutely worried that my opinion is just the result of what the Facebooks of the world show me.
But can I ask you, take you up on that one? Say I'm a book lover and I really read a lot of books, right? Then I'm, that's your personal recommendation system, right? So isn't it a completely different situation when I'm ready to buy more books and more books following Amazon's recommendation system than when I'm in a situation where I vote?
No, I'm going to jump in. This is my field, and I've been doing this for. So it is absolutely unquestionable, or beyond question, that micro-targeting works. Very, very sophisticated data science that is very predictive. And who watched The Great Hack? And if you haven't seen The Great Hack about Cambridge Analytica, it was very interesting. It was kind of a soap opera version of what happened, but. Micro-targeting works, and certainly you can use it for good or you can use it for bad, and I think that is the biggest question. Motive, intent, guardrails, is it an ethical use? Is there an inflection point for people to have transparency? But there's no doubt that Cambridge Analytica did something manipulative and unseemly and unfair, and they did it, the research that I've looked at, they targeted with these slightly varied, they'd rotate through, waterfall through a series of messages depending on the user that was behind the eyes on the ad. Is this person going to respond to this word, this word, that word? They crunched billions and billions and billions and billions of rows of records, and they adjusted and adjusted and adjusted to elicit an emotional response. There's no doubt that happened. I mean, I'll tell you one little quick story about a piece of work that we did for a client, for a retail client. They mapped with facial recognition technology emotions, which is just math, right? So they would map me the moment I walked into the retail store, and they would see me walk along and map me camera to camera at the top of my head, and they would see what display I stood in front of, and maybe I was on the way to the school clothes section for my kids, but I stopped in front of the shoe section, and my eyes lit up, and my started breathing heavier. I love those pink kitten heels, but I don't have money for those. I make my way on down to the schools, to the school uniform section. I get the clothes for the kids. I go check out. Well, guess what? By the time that I got to the counter, there was a discount on those pink kitten heels waiting for me. That's real. It's live. It's in stores.
So what
everywhere
company is that?
I can't tell you that.
No, I mean,
It's extensive.
So
Market
I've
basket
heard
analysis.
these stories many times. I'm with the board of one company called Coclasure, which does real analytics. I know AIB, what they're doing. So I actually think this is an urban myth.
Well, the diapers and beer is, but you're saying, do you know about diapers and beer?
It is a myth, and I think
Diapers
so
and beer
is that
But you're saying that...
No, it's not a myth, because we did the implementation. I'll tell you another one we did for a
No,
very
stay on that one. So what?
tell us. I'd like to hear it.
I'll tell you one that we did. I literally...
Sheila, what can you do actually to convince us that it's not just that video we all saw 6 years ago, but the price changes as you magically go?
I'll tell you one that we did, and I'm not going to name them either, but it was a very large vacation club, and we did the analytics behind what kind of person responded or had the most successful close rate with what kind of agent. And when you walked into the, this is 24 years ago, we did this implementation, and you do the number, we do a reverse phone append, we do all the data, we'd overlay about 1,700 data variables, and we do some data science, and we'd, in real time, match you up with the agent that appealed to whatever, the data science said, and the close rate jumped from 15% to 85%. And that was 24 years ago when we did.
But you're shifting. So I'm very specific. I took the example you took.
Okay.
I'm very much
There's a large
person who
clothing
calls
retailer
bullshit
that's
when
an American
he sees it. So I would like to have one piece of evidence that the story you told has actually been implemented, at least in one shop in the world, for at least one day in the lifetime of
Okay, I'll tell you what I'll do, Andreas. I will call up my friend who is the Global Chief Privacy Officer of this company, and we talked about that implementation, and I'll connect you with Michael, and you guys can have a talk. And if he wants to reveal it, you can.
Can I
Sounds
ask a
good.
question?
Be data literate. Be careful when people tell you stories.
I mean, all these marketing techniques, they are really old. They always
really old.
had the same goal
Yeah.
to manipulate the consumer. So nowadays, we become sort of excited about this technology, even though, of course, it has been datafied, but otherwise, not much has happened. We know these A/B testing methods. Even the Democratic Party has used them. The Obama campaign used them. Other candidates have used them, but I would still say if I'm not willing to donate any money, then A/B testing won't convince me to do so.
Yeah.
So I think the effect is limited.
Let me follow on Cambridge Analytica. What should we do about Facebook?
Can I ask one more question about Cambridge Analytica?
About one more-
Cambridge Analytica.
Okay.
So the chief information officers stormed the office, subpoenaed everything 1.5 years ago. Has any of you heard anything that they found? So in this democracy here, if something as important as Cambridge Analytica gets subpoenaed, they took the computers. And now we as citizens
So
don't
Andreas,
learn
you're
anything about
skeptical.
the
You're
results.
skeptical about Cambridge Analytica's power.
No, I'm surprised that within 1.5 years of these images in the front page of the paper, see Chief Information Officer, I think it says in the back, storming it. I have not heard a thing about the outcome. So can't they look at the computer files? Can't they look at the emails? What do these people do all day long that investigate it?
Jeanette, would you?
Picking up your question on what we should do about Facebook. First of all, I would not want to talk about Facebook specifically. I think we should rather talk about platforms in general. And then I would say we need a mixture. We need a legal framework. I'm sort of suspicious of the debate that we see in Europe, but also increasingly in the US about data and ethics. I think ethics in terms of self-binding principles for companies who accept these principles is not good enough in the long run. We really need a legal framework that sets boundaries for the industry. And my feeling is that many of the platform companies themselves come to the conclusion that they are dealing with problems that they're unable to solve in a satisfying way. So some of them would actually welcome a legal framework that sets boundaries to their business. But I don't think that this is good enough in the long run. We also need the platforms to sort of come up with frameworks for themselves and probably work with their customers or their citizens. I mean, Facebook is in the process of setting up an oversight board for content regulation, and I think that's a really good initiative.
I think it's a joke.
But this has nothing to do with the fact that you work for a competing company.
No, I totally don't work for myself. But, I didn't want to interrupt.
Do you think that Facebook should ban or should stop accepting political advertising? Would that be a step that would improve things?
No, I don't. I think then we run just into the next problem that would be to distinguish between political and non-political advertising. We would get into categorical conflicts.
Yeah.
And I would rather start from the assumption that these platforms have become sort of hybrid infrastructure. They fulfill a public function and are privately run. And what we need to think about is how we regulate this new beast that is in between. They are too important to just get away with saying that they're private companies. So we do need to develop a regulatory framework, and that would perhaps also imply rules for political advertising.
So this is not a European situation, but Section 230, this carve-out for, I know. Would that be an example of something that needs to be changed in the United States?
We have this discussion on both sides of the Atlantic. Should we sort of should we reform the safe harbor provision that enabled the existence of platforms to begin with? Some people say yes, others say no. I mean, indirectly we do this in Europe by sort of tightening the conditions under which safe harbor is exercised nowadays. Some of you might have heard of the network enforcement law that we got last year in Germany, in that probably 99% of Americans thought was awful. Many Germans dislike it too, but the idea that when there is sort of unlawful content on platforms, that something has to happen and that platforms have to take responsibility for unlawful content, I think that should become consensus.
Thoughts?
I think we do. From a U.S. perspective, we need a federal law. We need a federal law that holds companies accountable. The California law, CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, is a notice and choice law. A notice and choice transfers all the accountability to the user. If you can get them to say yes, you can do anything you want with the data. And that's not the right construct. We need something that goes to holding corporations accountable and political campaigns accountable for ethical, fair, and appropriate use of data. So yes, we need a federal law, self-reg, to supplement perhaps, but we need a federal guideline. There are other big signals, very important signals here in the United States that we're trying to do better. I think one of the ones I'm very encouraged by is the very important Business Roundtable changed their charter about 2.5 months ago, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but historically, the Business Roundtable, their charter has been corporations exist to create profit for shareholders, and they just changed their charter. Corporations now exist to create value for people, and I think that it always starts with intent, with motive, how you frame the issue, and then you build a program against it. I'll tell you, being in the field and being responsible for keeping data under control and used to create good impact and good consequence and detecting and preventing the harm, the really big fat challenge and where most of the failures are today is the departure, the difference, the gap between a well-written policy by your legal folks and the operationalization of the program. And it is that gap, this by design concept, you'll hear it called privacy by design, privacy engineering, applied data ethics. It's operationalized data governance is the hardest thing to do. Adjacent to that are these new and emerging fields, and it's kind of all the same bucket. How do you use data fairly? It's things like content moderation, which is an emerging field, and you'll see some structure and some professionalism and some guardrails wrapped around that. You'll see this new thing called brand safety, which goes specifically to marketing. How do you, where do you, under what circumstances do you place ads? How far do you go? How far do you not go? So I think we're beginning to really wrangle with some of these bigger issues. It's not fixed now. We have a lot of work to do.
So are there microphones out there to bring the audience in, or do we have some? Something. Okay, good. One last question before we go to the audience. So one of the ways Facebook exercises its power and its control is through its, I guess, ownership of the social graph. From a technology point of view, why has it been so difficult to break apart? Are there paths to sort of decentralizing the social graph or making that more?
It's called data primacy. First parties that have these massive user bases have data primacy, and they guard that, and they lock down the use of it, and they have all the power right now. They just do.
I would say even in China, this is actually an issue, right? The Chinese government it's really interesting is that the Communist Party has always controlled they call them the commanding heights of the economy. So all like critical industries, oil, gas, steel, is all controlled by China, but not in the internet, not in technology. And these companies do actually, they are legally required to hand over data, but they don't want to. Right, and so the Communist Party is actually really, they're sort of afraid of their own tech companies for this reason, because they have that data and they guard it really, really jealously. So,
Andreas, could we rethink
last year, Tencent, the makers of WeChat, invited me to do a workshop in Shenzhen, China, entitled "What Can We Learn from Facebook?" And I think it was an awesome experience for me, at least, because I learned that some of the things they say are actually true. Like, they don't want to keep the data of the people because they don't want to get calls by Beijing. So by simply not having the data, not retaining the data, that is what makes their life easier. Interesting enough on identity, when I checked in, I needed to give them my Chinese mobile phone number. And I said, why do you need my mobile number? So they trust actually China Mobile, who needs your passport, more than they trust their own WeChat identity system.
Jeanette, one last point, and then we'll go to the audience.
In Europe, we've had a debate on data ownership over the last years, and I looked a bit into the literature, and what you can see, for example, from OECD studies, is that there is a lot of social and economic wealth unrealized because we, at the moment, monopolize data in a few hands. So if these companies could be convinced or coerced to sort of share the data with other companies, we all would probably benefit quite a lot.
What does data ownership actually mean? I don't know whether I understand that concept.
That's a deep. That's a deep concept. Let's take some questions from the audience. Raise your hand if you. There's one back there. Maybe introduce yourself and then him. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Hello, my name is Sebastian Kellner. I'm living here in Silicon Valley for 2 years, originally from Germany, working with an AI company. And I'm wondering, when we think about sharing data, I think we should ask the user much more than we do that right now. Because when we see the economic power that we have with the data, I think it's really the question of, is the value generated for the user that was willing to bring in the data in the first instance? Just a answer to the discussion of how much economic data we can generate with a data ownership, if we want so. I think it's very much related to GDPR. And another question I would be really interested in is, isn't that a problem that we're discussing right now? Because we have a very, very illiquid market in terms of global players in the digital world. If we would have 10 Amazons, 10 Facebooks, and 10 Googles, which we all know we won't have because we will always have 3 big ones, wouldn't we have this kind of question because we would have different competitive edges in terms of data privacy, in terms of data handling, in terms of offerings to the individuals that could decide whom they want to trust their data on?
Any thoughts about?
I want to unpack one thing that you raise a very important question, and I think this is fundamental to this whole discussion, is where does the data come from? How is it originated? Under what circumstance? And therefore, what permissioning and what value extraction? So now think about data. There's a continuum of data, and think about where it really originates. Some of it originates as a result of a healthcare event, right? That's in the United States. I'm going to use US vernacular. That is regulated under HIPAA. It's a federal law, and then there's some state laws. If it's a financial transaction, that's regulated under both FCRA and GLBA. A lot of the rest of the data is regulated kind of disproportionately or to a much, much lesser degree, and generally into the bucket of called marketing, right? That data is then used to fulfill your service and subsequently market to you. And I want to make one very important point. Now, marketing, Cambridge Analytica being a great example, a very bad actor doing very bad things very intentionally is not the entire rest of the ecosystem. So if that's one unicorn bad guy, look at the rest, 99.9% of the entire market is trying very hard to use data responsibly. Profitably, maybe not as limited or with as much restraint as they need to, but really the intent of most marketing is to connect, delight, amuse, be the guardian of culture. And here's the fundamental. That marketing and advertising engine is a financial engine. It's why there's free internet. It's why there's free content. It pays for everything, for almost everything. And if you don't have marketing and advertising uses of data, you have paywalls. And so when you do that, I mean, we can do that and we can flip this. It's the most socioeconomically challenged in our population that have this different version of what is still free, and those with a big enough wallet can pay for a very different experience. That undermines democracy. Now, it's complex, but we need to unpack it, and you need to understand that data there's a range of data types and data origination with rules on original use and secondary use and permission structures and streams. So it's not all one. It's a very complex, and if you want to talk about it offline, I'm glad.
We had a question. Yeah, we've got you. Good. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Justin. I'm a Swiss law student in Santa Clara, and I'm wondering, like, my question relates to something similar, like the bad guys versus the entire ecosystem, and I would like to touch upon the intermediary liability. So when talking about the intermediary liability, everyone thinks about Facebook, like, like copyright infringement or like stuff that just shouldn't be up there. But now let's think about the system as a whole. Like, for example, like, how do you think intermediary liability would impact, for example, Wikipedia or other like free knowledge systems out there? Do you think it would ultimately, like, could it ultimately benefit Facebook because they are able to comply with those rules while other smaller players with very good intentions might be cut out?
I mean, I'm going to jump in. Just saying that compliance is costly, and so the big guys have near unlimited resources. They can pay multi-billion-dollar fines. So a smaller guy is going to have trouble managing the compliance costs. It's true.
But
3 sentences. Not only is compliance costly, but so is the user time. So don't have the illusion that you can make decisions about what you want to. I mean, I don't have the illusion that I can make decisions because I just don't have the time to think about the things which happen to my data. 2, the value of data, I believe, is in the decisions we make. And 3, the value of data often comes from combining data from different sources.
Jeanette, I think you're going to have the last one.
To my knowledge, Wikipedia would not be exempt from intermediary liability.
Okay.
So are you assuming that they are exempt? But generally, I fully agree with you. The whole filter technology being applied in terms of copyright enforcement, it sort of hurts small companies much more than big companies such as YouTube.
So we're at 4 o'clock. We have the answers to the 3 questions. We have almost 100 votes, and so I'm going to declare this as a statistically valid sample, more or less. The first question, will we survive the internet? 81% of you believe that we will. The second question, should Facebook and Google be broken up? That's actually the most interesting answer. Well, maybe not. It is almost equal. 50% say yes, 49% say no. And the final question, will China achieve its goal of world leadership in AI by 2030? 67% of you believe that it will. So on that note, join me in thanking the panel for talking about the market. That was fun. Thank you.